Within the first 4 months of my relationship with G, I lost 40 pounds and weighed a pitiful 96 pounds. Damn. The stress of the physical and verbal abuse had taken a toll on my body and spirit. G called me skinny and ugly. I had no problem telling me how unattractive I was to him since the weight loss. Life at our house was torture. It was common to see me with bruises up and down my body. His ex-girlfriend would come by the house, and even though she hated me, she'd sometimes cry at the sight of my emaciated, bruised and swollen body. Still, I protected him. On one occasion, we were playing a video game in the living room. He was sitting on the couch and I was on the other. During the game, he began to call me a stupid bitch. G had a way of looking at me with disgust that turned my stomach, and sometimes I would just throw up at the outset of an argument. He gave me the look, and at that moment, I tried to be brave and fight back. I wanted to be tough, just as he had been to me. I wanted to let him know that I too was a force to be reckoned with. But all I could do was throw the game controller at him. It landed lightly on his lap, but it wouldn't have mattered if it hadn't hit him at all. That I showed any kind of mutiny was reason enough for what happened next. Okay, so I'm going to put out a trigger warning. Within seconds, he rose from his seat and punched me in my right side. It must have been a kidney punch, the type that boxers received, because my body crumpled to the floor. I wasn't able to stretch out. My organs had shut down and I couldn't breathe. I was suffocating. And he hit me one more time. I feared I would die. I tried to speak, but I couldn't. I was barely able to say the words, "I can't breathe." All of a sudden, he stood over me with his balled fists, and his anger turned to fright. He picked my stiff body off the floor and began to administer CPR, and opened the front door and began to yell onto the street for help. And in my waning consciousness, I began to feel sorry for him and less concerned about me. One of the neighbours was a nurse, and she administered CPR. The ambulance arrived a few minutes later. Once I arrived at the hospital, the nurses and doctors asked me how I'd cracked my ribs. G answered for me. She was running and tripped over the chair. When the nurse was alone with me, she inspected my bruised side. I knew she did not believe G's version of what happened, especially because there was evidence of an imprint of his fist. Oh my God. But I backed up his story. I protected my daddy. It was as if I was suffering from a case of Stockholm Syndrome, during which the hostage somehow becomes enamoured with the captor, and even begins to identify with the captor as a defence mechanism born out of fear of violence. Even the smallest acts of kindness by the captor are magnified. These symptoms occurred under tremendous emotional and physical distress. This behaviour is considered a common survival strategy for victims of interpersonal abuse and has been observed in battered spouses and abused children. Though I needed to get out of this dangerous, extremely unhealthy relationship, I sided with G and returned to that house. Once we returned home from the hospital, I found it hard to even walk. I turned on the water in our glass in-shower as he lit the fire in the adjacent double-sided fireplace. Sharp pains ran all through my body as I stood under the water. I began to cry as I realised I could not raise my hand to wash myself. I was so broken and couldn't even get myself clean. G heard my sobs, and in his charming way, he disrobed and joined me in the shower. He hurt me and then made it all better as he washed me and gently and showered me with kisses and repeatedly whispered, "I love you." Still, the abuse continued. I was not allowed to check the mailbox after a while because he thought I was seeing somebody around the corner, where the community mailboxes were located. I was not allowed to learn how to drive or hold a job or to further my education beyond receiving my GED. On the few occasions when I got employed at the local mall, he called the job constantly, and I frequently called home, feeling guilty for leaving him alone. It wasn't unusual for him to say to me, "I need you, come home." It was common for me to run back to him rather than moving towards gaining my independence. One day, I woke up and decided I didn't want to live like this anymore. In fact, I didn't want to live. I took a full bottle of prescription painkillers and was rushed to the hospital, where they made me drink charcoal to neutralise the effect of the medicine. There was times when I locked myself in a closet with GUNs, playing with its barrel and trigger, wanting to, myself, hesitating only because I was afraid of the pain. I wanted out of life, one way or another. Living with one of hip-hop's pioneers, I started to get lost in the new world of hip-hop and glorious videos accompanying the latest hot singles. I looked enviously at the women in these videos, their bodies perfectly voluptuous, while mine was gaunt and disgusting. Their faces were all made up, mine was plain, which only the shine of lip balm on my lips. Their clothes were tight-fitting and mine hung loosely from my stick-like frame. I wanted to be there wherever they were. That was my greatest wish, to be beautiful and strong and free. G would become upset with me if I liked someone else's music too much. He would take another artist's success as a reminder of his own increasing irrelevance. Cool G Rap began and sustained his career in the 80s and into the early 90s. He had been dubbed one of hip-hop's most revered pioneers, yet he had not been as successful or recognized as one of his many counterparts. It was easy for some to remember Big Daddy Kane, Biz Markie, and Rakim, artists who enjoyed more mainstream success. But G stayed more underground, rarely finding himself on MTV. As his protege Nas did. Ooh, Nas came up under Cool G Rap. Okay. When we were together, it appeared that his peers and even his students would surpass him. His most popular singles, like Streets of New York, Ill Street Blues, and Road to the Riches, are rarely ever heard outside of the East Coast tri-state area. He was big at a time where there was no SoundScan, the tool that is used to track record sales. He never had the privilege of knowing just how many records he had sold, whereas his young counterparts were going platinum plus in the mid to late 90s. This sense of failure or incompletion, I believe, is what fueled G's rage at times. I would find myself watching videos when he wasn't around, so I would not make him angry while I was dreaming of a new life. For now, I would remain in the nightmare called my life. There were multiple abortions and miscarriages. I'd reached the end of my rope. I staggered to the bathroom, and after locking the door behind me, I fell to my knees and continued to cry over the toilet. I prayed to God to save me. I begged him to give me a child who would be strong enough to live inside me and endure the abuse. I promised him if he would answer my prayer, it would be my motivation to leave. My existence alone was not enough. I needed another reason to save my life. I knew that having a child would bring me back to health and give me the strength to live without G. I prayed to God for that chance. Later that night, my son was conceived. Before long, G and I were at it again. I can't remember what the fight was about, but in the middle of him kicking me out of the house yet again, I blurted out, "I'm pregnant." His response was typical. "Bitch, I don't care, get out." So I did. I stayed with friends for the next 2 weeks until G allowed me to come back home. I was made to sleep in the guest room on the floor with just one blanket and one pillow. I was not allowed in the master suite at any time during the day unless I had been summoned to have sex with him. It would mostly be oral. He called it my apology. G would stroke the back of my head and say things like, "That's right, show daddy how sorry you are. Apologise to your daddy. S daddy's D. And daddy won't be mad at you anymore. That's what a good girl is supposed to do." Okay. He made me perform on him for up to 2 hours at a time. On one occasion, it went so long my nose bled. It was supposed to be my way of taking responsibility for whatever I had done to make him so angry. It was always my fault, and I was always made to apologise. The pregnancy proved to be a difficult one. I was constantly sick and unable to stand even the sight of certain foods, especially meat. I was unable to keep anything down and continued to be underweight at a time when I should have been putting on weight from the baby's growth inside of me. I was also severely anemic and found it hard to get out of bed to shower, much less to perform the daily household chores. Still, I was made to cook and clean and carry on. The rule was that G should never have to cook his own meals or do anything else around the house as long as there was a woman living with him. One day, we were in the midst of yet another battle when he ordered me to leave the house. He packed up most of my things and had them waiting by the door. I was about 3 months pregnant at this time, and it was the middle of the night. Day, we were in the midst of yet another battle when he had ordered me to leave the house. He packed up most of my things and had them waiting by the door. I was about 3 months pregnant at this time, and it was the middle of the night. I was crying and shaking and screaming out to him, "I have nowhere to go. Where will I go? It's 2 a.m. His answer was for me to phone a shelter. So, at his command, I thumbed through the yellow pages and found a shelter with an open bed that would pick me up from the house. I continued to cry and beg for him to just let me sleep there, even offering to go back to the guest bedroom and sleep on the floor. He denied me. Yet, while I was waiting for the shelter to come and get me, G had one more order to place, and that was for me to make him a steak. So, wait, you're kicking me out. I'm 3 months pregnant. It's 2 o'clock in the morning, and you want me to make you a steak? Okay. I stood there, making his steak, crying and shaking, and begging to stay. I became nauseous and began cooking and throwing up simultaneously. G's concern was not for my health or for the health of his unborn child, but that his steak would not be burned. Just a few moments after I served him his perfectly cooked steak, my ride was at the door. I was then hauled off to a homeless shelter in the seediest section of downtown Phoenix, my designer bags filled with designer clothes and shoes. There were about 10 other women in the room to which I was assigned. There was only one shower where up to 5 women could bathe at a time, with no curtain to shield their bodies from anyone walking by. I had only 20 cents in my purse and managed to borrow a nickel from one of the homeless women who was a permanent resident at the shelter. With the 25 cedis, I called one of my best friends, Cecily, and she took me home with her in the morning. I was lucky I had somewhere to go. The other women at the shelter had nothing. There was so much despair and hopelessness around me. I could feel the hopelessness. Eventually, I returned home to G and all of the awful things that came with living in his house. Throughout the rest of my pregnancy, the abuse continued. During my 4th month, it had become almost physically impossible for me to have sex. It was extremely painful and would also make me nauseous. Still, that was of no concern to G, and on many occasions we had sex even when I didn't want to. He ignored my tears as I cried through each episode. I can remember him yelling at me after sex because the crying made it difficult for him to reach orgasm. Again, I was being a bad girl. As a result, oral sex became more prevalent in our relationship. My mouth and neck were in constant pain. There was just no way I could refuse him. It got to the point where just the smell of his skin would make me throw up. I could not serve him anymore without making him feel unloved and unwanted. G would make me pay over and over again. In the 7th month of pregnancy, G had been called away to New York for work. Not long after his arrival in the city, I was awakened by a call from one of his friends. G had had a grand mal seizure in the limo on the way to the airport. It wasn't his first seizure. The problem began many years before I met him. G had told me that he had pre-existing condition that required brain surgery. He also mentioned that on another occasion he had been rushed to the hospital after he had been sniffing cocaine with his friend and singer Bobby Brown. From what I had been told, G had not been doing any drugs at the time of his seizure in the limo. He told me that last time he did was actually just a few weeks after we met. Was given to him by the assistant of one of my NFL friends, the linebacker with whom G had also become friends, not knowing of my sexual past with the athlete. Several hours after I received the phone call about G's seizure, I got on a flight and was in upstate New York to check G out of hospital. His neck was sore and he had bitten his tongue, which was swollen and tender. It softened my heart to see him so fragile. You know what? It just reminds me of, what is it, Diary of a Mad Woman? Is that it? When he does her dirty and then, she has to go and look after him and how she fucks with him. Just got a flashback of that for some reason. But we know Karine won't do that. It's not at this point. We know she is completely and utterly, she's too far gone at this moment in time. It was the first time I had ever seen him actually need me. I held his hands and helped him out of bed. I helped him get dressed and put on his shoes. We walked out of there together, and anything that had gone wrong in our relationship was no longer a factor. Wow. Over the next 2 weeks, G and I stayed with his mother, Hanifa, in the South Ozone Park section of Queens, New York. South Ozone Park? I've never heard of that. The house was a disaster. There were roaches everywhere and everything was falling apart. I'd lived in less modern, less desirable places during my life, but I had never seen anyone living in this type of shambles. I was shocked, thinking about how well G and I lived in comparison to his own mother. That is bad, isn't it? Still, I loved being there with his mother and the rest of his family. G's mother and I slept in the same bed. She would place her hands on my stomach and feel my son moving. She would cry and talk to him in her sweet, tiny voice. G was away from the house in the recording studio for most of our days there, so his mother and I lay in bed watching The Young and the Restless, game shows and talk shows. She was extremely ill and frequently had to use a wheelchair to get around. She needed help getting out of bed and down the stairs. She had many pains in her life, but her son and our unborn baby brought her renewed joy. For the most part, things were going well at this time. G and I had not fought in a while and were getting along, but the peace in our lives was only temporary. One day, while G and I showered together, he said, "I think we need another woman to take your place since you can't fuck properly." Damn. "I think we need another woman to take your place since you can't fuck properly." I was appalled. The look on his face was almost innocent, as if he saw no wrong in what he had just said to his pregnant wife. I blew up and jumped out the shower. He followed me around the house as I yelled, and he yelled back. I couldn't understand. He made it seem as if it was all my fault, and that because of me, he had to have another woman. The fight continued downstairs where his mother sat in the wheelchair. "What the hell is going on?" she asked in a loud voice as she could muster. She worked herself out of the chair and began to confront her son. I had worked myself into hyperventilation and severe stomach cramps. Without much warning, I collapsed. His poor, sick mother tried her best to hold me up when she herself should have been in a wheelchair. G, again, not concerned about either of us, stormed out of the house. I could never win with him. No matter how much wrong he had done, his mother could never completely side against her son. How could she? What's more, his mother needed G more than I did. He was the only breadwinner in the family, and everyone depended on him for support. G suffered another seizure once we returned to Arizona. He had stopped taking the Tegretol that he had been prescribed by his doctor to help control his seizures. He said that taking the medicine made him feel like less of a man. During the first week of January 1998, his seizures returned. I was 9 months pregnant at the time. G had been in the hallway bathroom, and while he was sitting on the toilet, the seizure hit. I heard him falling off the toilet and shaking against the tub. I jumped out of bed and ran to his side. Oh, next video. Peace. I heard him falling off the toilet and shaking against the tub. I jumped out of bed and ran to his side. His eyes were rolled back in his head, and his tongue was hanging out and locked between his teeth. Gross. I quickly called 911, grabbed his bottle of Gradol, called his mother and unlocked the front door. I then ran to wipe his ass, flush the toilet and pull up his boxers so he wouldn't be embarrassed when the ambulance arrived. Wow, you did all of that. And look at... I'm speechless. You did all of that for somebody that kicked you out in the middle of the night, has been physically, mentally, emotionally, financially abusive to you. I don't know whether you're a great person or you just have no personal agency. Once they had him on a gurney, I got dressed and grabbed a set of clean clothes for him to wear when he left the hospital to return home. All of this was done in a matter of minutes. No matter the abuse and the trauma I suffered on his watch, I still took care of him. Is that a badge of honour? Like, is she saying that, it doesn't matter what happened, like I still took care of him, like I still would, like that's my man? Or is she being like, after everything that he did, I still took care of him? Like, I can't believe this shit. I'm not really sure what her tone is here. Over the next 2 weeks, I nursed G back to health. He had a cocktail of medications which had to be administered every 3 hours or so. I made sure he took all of them on time, even in the middle of the night. I would set my alarm clock to wake me up at 11 at night and at 2 and 5 in the morning. I ignored my pregnancy needs at the time to be sure to get him well. Babes, when have you paid any attention to your pregnancy needs though? I would also rub his neck and shoulders every few hours, for they had been severely injured during his seizure. Soon, G fully recovered, and within days of his recovery, we were back in the hospital to welcome our baby boy. On January 17, 1999, I went into labour. On that day, I stayed home and counted my contractions. By the next morning, the pain was unbelievable. So we checked into the Thunderbird Samaritan Hospital. G stayed with me every second. He supported me fully and was the charming and loving man I knew him to be from time to time. I was just 19 years old, and for the next 24 hours, I continued to be overwhelmed with pain until finally, 51 hours into my labour, Jesus, my son was born. After almost 3 full days and the legal limit of 5 epidurals, I was exhausted. G seemed to be excited and jumped around the room taking pictures. I couldn't physically feel the moment that my son was born, but as I pushed, I focused on G's face as he winked at me to check and see if I was all right. I winked back as a signal that everything was just fine. Indeed, the most amazing thing was happening to me. As my son was being delivered from my body, the love I thought I felt for G automatically transferred to the new man in my life. And from that moment, at 12:11 on the afternoon of January 19th, 1999, I no longer loved Cool G Rap.